Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Hey, Earth Keepers. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that one of our frequent and recent guests is Victoria Loorz, one of the founders of the Wild Church movement. Well, we just have to have her back again because she's come out with a new book called Field Guide to Church of the Wild. As you'll see from today's conversation, this is a really practical book that highlights all kinds of spiritual practices that people are creating in their efforts to connect faith and creation. Victoria, welcome back to the podcast. You now have the honor of being the most frequent guest on the podcast over our 5+ years. So welcome back again.
Oh, I love that. That means something, right?
Well, that's all about kindred spirits, and we are trying to do very similar things in the world. So yeah, we really appreciate your time and definitely appreciate your time to tell us about this new book that you've come out with. You've written a book called Field Guide to Church of the Wild, and I'm sure that our listeners are intrigued by that title, but what can you tell folks about this book that maybe will help them decide whether they need to read it or not? I mean, what was your intention in writing it, and to whom were you writing?
Yeah. Well, the intention was basically a follow-up from Church of the Wild, how nature invites us into the sacred, and a common request that I got from people, and that we get all the time, is there a wild church near me? How can I do this? How can I do church outside and in direct relationship with God, outside of the structures and the strictures of a building? It seems like it's not that big of a deal, but it actually does cut us off from some of that direct connection with God. And so this field guide was in collaboration with the Wild Church Network, and who is led right now by Valerie Searles, who's my sister. And I can say a little bit more about that later. But we wrote it because we had been hearing for years, like, do you have resources for us to start to do something like this in our area? And it was just hard to collect them. All of the Wild Church leaders, and there's over 200 of them, are doing this on the side, and are doing this out of passion and out of their own need to create community that is in direct and loving and intimate relationship with the land. They haven't really had time to say, hey, here, I'll send you everything I've been doing. So we thought if we wrote a book, we sent out a call for stories and practices and prayers and poems. So this book is really a collection of those. And so what we did, we call it a field guide. And there's some things like on the edges, it looks like a field guide. And the illustrations are actually all done by my daughter's partner, Manny Green, and my daughter, who has an MFA in creative writing and book publishing. She's the one who designed the interior, because we really wanted this to look like and feel like, playfully feel like a field guide where we can get ideas and resources to do this kind of gathering ourselves. Although it's also for people that just want to do it by themselves.
Well, that does raise the question. You call it a field guide to Church of the Wild. Maybe for the listeners who are not familiar with Church of the Wild, you could tell us what that is, and then maybe how this book, while it's aimed at those folks in the movement, it also speaks to a broader audience. But let's start with Church of the Wild. What is that?
Well, let me just read the second paragraph in the book, because it explains it in 2 sentences. Church of the Wild, practiced as a personal spirituality or in communion with other people, is more than a novel way to do church outside. It's an emerging and yet ancient spiritual practice of reconnecting with the rest of the living world as kin. It's a practice of resacralizing our wild and alive earth, and in the process, remembering our role in the web of life. So it began with me just kind of like playing, and I had been studying and been interested in and practicing different ways of reconnecting my own tradition as a Christian pastor with the rest of the alive world, because that's where I really experienced the numinous presence of God more than anything else. And so I began asking those questions, the kind of questions that I explore in Church of the Wild. But then when I just started this, where we just met outside, at least half of the time we gathered together, we would wander on our own separately just to listen contemplatively to the land and then come back together and share in a council side of thing. Kind of took the idea of a sacred conversation with the holy, with God, with the land, with our own hearts, with one another seriously. And so the whole thing is built around that. And then I found that there were more and more people, mostly pastors, needing something deeper and recognizing in the same way, just completely unrelated to my journey, that they were going and doing the same thing. And so we started the Wild Church Network in 2016. And at first it was almost all Christian pastors who were pastoring another indoor church and feeling they needed to start this on their own. And it's grown to now, and I don't know the statistics, but I should. I would say a significant number of people are not pastors, are not ordained. They are just people who are yearning for this kind of gathering, who experience the presence of God in and between all things. And so like our programs within Seminary of the Wild there's a 7-week program called Wild Church Leadership, just helps people to say, you know what? It's you. You are a spiritual leader simply by being willing to gather people together and saying yes. It's really about trusting yourself. That's what this book is. Here are some common aspects, common elements of a wild church service. Because the interesting thing is really all of us that in the beginning, there's like 30 of us that started meeting in 2016, had come to this from different directions, different denominations, different influences, but we were doing essentially the same thing. And so we just kind of took those commonalities and that became the different chapters of this book, because there's no how-to. This is not like a new religion. This is not like, here's what you have to do to be in. And so there's people from Buddhist traditions. There's people from all different denominations. There's people from spiritual but not religious. And there's people that have never had any connection with the Christ tradition who feel very welcome in this kind of a gathering. Even if there's people from all different backgrounds in the same gathering, we have this common ground, which is the ground. And it's also just set up to where each person's sharing their own experience. So there's no kind of like need to convince everybody else that my way of talking about this, my experience is the right way and your way is wrong. I'm going to tell you why. So it's got that kind of baked in.
Well, it seems to me that while this isn't a how-to book, what it clearly is a book that perhaps encourages and enables people to maybe start their own wild church community, because sometimes it's hard to know where to start. It's like, what are some basic practices that we can begin with? And it seems like this book maybe makes that possible, almost democratizing in some ways the possibilities of Church of the Wild.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. In the back, there's field notes, but it's just several pages of like, here's some things to do to get started. First one is listening to your own soul, listening to your own yearnings, listening to what are your values? How do you measure success of church? Are there new decolonized ways to do that? And then it's listening to your place as you engage in the core practice of wild church, which is what we call wandering or sacred sauntering. It's just being out in nature in a reverent way. So you're not just trying to get up to the top of the hill as fast as possible for exercise. Completely nothing wrong with that. But it's slowing down. That's what opens up your heart to, and your approach becomes a reverent approach. And you're opening yourself up to awe. I was just talking with somebody the other day. They were actually doing a magazine article for Backpacker magazine. And they're a backpacker. And they didn't have any kind of spiritual background. But they heard that something in Sedona, which is like this holy portals and stuff. And so he was like, oh, that sounds like a bunch of hogwash. And I don't understand it. And I agree, I don't understand that. But his pure curiosity about that opened him up to an experience of awe that he had when he wandered out. And so this experience of the holy, this experience of awe is something that most of us have had in our lifetimes. And what Church of the Wild does is say, this is an authentic and personal and actually very human experience of religion. If religion means what it means at the etymological core, reconnection, religament. And so this is reconnecting with the holy that is all things, in and between all things.
So let's say that someone picked up your book and opened it to the middle and read a couple of the stories of practices that are happening in Church of the Wild. Do you think that they would be able to actually fully understand or even fully utilize them if, in fact, they had no interest in Wild Church?
I think so. I mean, like the first time I started gathering people, I didn't really have a name for it yet. And I didn't explain anything. I just said, go out and listen and come back and we'll share. Like literally is all we said. It's like if all things truly are imbued with holiness, a channel of God's communication, a connection with God, however we want to say it, if that's true, then we don't have to convince people. We don't have to have particular ways of right and wrong, or we don't have to talk people into it. We don't have to even have the theological grounding for it. We just have to experience it and value that as authentic. So if you did take something in the center here, it might spark something in you to go in and create and just be open to a possible experience in your place.
Yeah, it seems to me that you're in some ways giving permission to people to consider what they already know, what's already inside of them, that God has revealed in creation. You're giving permission for them to actually value that and almost giving it credibility. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the field guide component. Like, why do you call it a field guide specifically?
We all can kind of say we're part of nature. Nature isn't something out there. We are part of it. We can say we are part of the ecosystem. We are the human aspect of any ecosystem. But how do we actually practice the holiness of that? And so a field guide is sort of a just playful way of describing. This is something that is grounded in our actual relationship that we have with the rest of our place, all of the other beings in our place. And so a field guide is the kind of thing you go to when you're going to go out hiking and you want to identify trees and mushrooms and birds. And this is a way of identifying ways that we can connect with those trees and butterflies and birds. And in a way that's relational. And it's not just usury. It's not just a resource. These trees are not just lumber. And I think anyone who has that kind of reverent relationship with the natural world, even if they haven't given those words to it, like you said, already practicing it. And so I guess that's where the field guide came from. It's a fun way of saying, we know this. We just want to identify it for ourselves, for our particular place. So we say it again and again, that this field guide is a reinforcement that you know this within yourself and that you can trust your relationship with God. And there's no doing this wrong. And sometimes there is. There's an example, like one of the practices in here is about asking permission before you sit down to listen to and enter into a relationship with or a conversation with a particular place. You sit down aside of a creek next to an oak tree. But there's something that indigenous spirituality that's very foundational in most indigenous spiritualities is this idea of permission. It humbles us to say you can't just walk up and expect the wild ones to give you everything you need, the wisdom you need, and the experience you want, because that's not relationship. If you and I were going to sit down together at a coffee shop we'd never met before, I wouldn't just sit down and start talking to you. I'd say, hey, can I take this seat? And ask permission in a way to enter into a conversation. And so it's the same thing. And there's something really powerful about that we and in our Western culture have forgotten. Without appropriating, we can learn from our kin, our relatives, from other cultures that have been disconnected less long ago, or not disconnected at all from intimate relationship with all that is. And so I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. Well, field guide, to me at least as an ethnographer, implies that there's a real emphasis on the practical and a real emphasis on knowledge that comes out of practice, knowledge that comes from a place or a people. And that actually really reflects the format, the stylistic choices that you've made in how to write this book. Maybe describe what readers could expect if they read this book. It's not reading like a typical chapter 1, 2, 3. Here's an idea for each chapter, but you take a different approach. Describe that.
Yeah, we didn't expect this to be something you read from beginning to end. It's not something to read that way. Like a field guide, you don't sit down and read a field guide or an encyclopedia front cover to end. It's something you can skip around. You can kind of read the short essays at the beginning to get an idea of what it is. But at the very beginning, there's a beautiful illustration of an oak tree, of a California live oak tree. And there's different numbers. Like in any field guide, they'll have a picture of a tree and they'll have a letter pointing to each of the different parts of the tree. And so we did that. We just playfully had these different parts of the tree that connect with the different chapters. And then on the other side, it says, Anatomy of a Wild Church. Again, tongue-in-cheek. Emergence, leadership, grounding, stories, rituals, cycles, saunterings, sharing, reciprocity. So those are each of the different chapters. And so those are just different aspects of an experience of creating sacred presence in the presence of this holy land. And we all are standing on holy ground.
I think this approach, considering this as a field guide, maybe even makes the entryway into this whole idea of reconnecting to nature, of finding God, God's revelation in nature. It makes it just a lot less formidable. There are really interesting, easy first steps to try. And as I read the book, I really was thinking about people who are in established, regular indoor churches who do have a curiosity that they would like to follow. They know that in their experience, they do perceive God's revelation in nature. So they know that it's not necessarily something that is affirmed by their church community, but it seems to me that this book could be read by any of those who maintain their commitment to maybe more conventional, traditional indoor churches, and it just gives them almost another dimension of faith praxis. Has that been your experience?
Yes, there's a lot of churches who have been adopting these kinds of practices as something they'll integrate in their week or once a month. I've heard of different churches in a community getting together and collaborating together and meeting a local park. It's a common ground even across religion. I've heard of communities, I think even there in Seattle, who have gotten together with a Jewish congregation, a synagogue, and other religions together where they're able to practice this together. It's non-sectarian in a way, but it's not saying it doesn't matter. It's saying bring who you are, bring your religious tradition. You don't need to dismantle anything that you've already been practicing. It's to restore connection with something that was originally, even within our own traditions, very deeply interwoven. When I first started even being aware of this was 35 years ago when I created the creation care kits for evangelical churches. To say there's ways you can bring this into your service. I had this whole big kit that was sent to thousands of evangelical churches to say, here's nature sounds you can play during your worship singing. Here's different hymns. Here's different scriptures. Here's the way that every single spiritual leader in both the Old Testament and the New Testament were called into the wild, and how Jesus went into the wilderness to pray every single time. This is nothing strange to the Christian tradition, but it has been severed. We have been disconnected from it. And so restoring it, there may be some resistance because we've been listening to a story that says only what happens within this building, within this book, within this professional preacher's mouth is what is orthodox and everything else is suspect. So we've all kind of like hidden within ourselves our authentic experiences of God. And this is just giving us permission to say, actually, we can trust that and we can step into that. And then people who have never been involved in a church community or are scared of it and would never want to walk into a Christian church, this is something that they're that they do anyway. How many people have said to you, nature is my church? Well, this is taking that seriously. And also another piece is for a lot of the nuns and duns, so to speak, that have left church, who have been wounded by Christianity, or just couldn't tolerate the history and the reality of brutality throughout the story, the Christian story throughout time, and therefore can't participate at all, have left the church. And yet there's a huge gap. There's a yearning and a longing for that permission to talk with other people, to be open about our spiritual journeys. Difficult outside of the container of church to have that kind of spiritual community. So this very simple way of gathering with others can be initiated by anybody. And you'd be surprised at the kind of people that show up. Even those who do a wild church as part of their indoor church, they found that a lot of other people from the community who would never come to their building come to their monthly gatherings. So there's that as well.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, I think there's a really important explanations of who this book is for. On the one hand, you're saying that perhaps there are many people in conventional churches who want to maybe expand and diversify their faith experience, their faith practice. You're also saying this book and the practices described in it could also be an entryway for people who otherwise wouldn't approach the church for various reasons. And those folks, and there are many of them, who have walked away from church because they no longer have that sustainable relationship to the church, and yet they're still wanting more. Another audience is coming to mind even as you speak, and as you describe those kits. Circlewood, which is the parent organization of this podcast, we focus a lot on helping church leaders and pastors in particular to find ways to help their congregations take steps forward into say, greener theology or a more nature-based faith practice. There's lots and lots of pastors who are asking us to help them with that. It seems to me that this is a great resource. So having read it, I would actually recommend it to any pastor who's at least asking that question. Is there something more to God's revelation than just Scripture? I'm hearing so much about a movement to reconnect with the wild. I'm looking at my own instincts to see and sense the presence of God in nature. This book, I think, responds to those questions, those points of curiosity about what it might look like to move a congregation in that direction. So I want to also recommend it to pastors, and I'm sure you already have, and you work with pastors as well. So, well, I want to back up a little bit because we kind of skipped over your co-author, and that's really important. Tell us about your sister and why it made sense for you to write this book in collaboration with her.
Well, let's see. So when I started the First Church of the Wild back in 2015, we had been talking about my journey the 3 years before I started Church of the Wild was aligned with hers. We're sort of discovering the kinds of the word conversation, logos as conversation, those kinds of things. And so when I started the First Church, she's not a pastor, and she was supportive, but she came out to California. She was in Virginia, and she came out to California and joined us at one of our first half a year. And as we talked about it, it was like, you can do this. You just start one in Virginia. And so I came out and we started the first one here, and she kept it going, and hers is still going here. And she's within the Mennonite community. She met somebody else in Canada in the Mennonite community, started a forest church. And then somebody else, we just kind of kept meeting people. And after a while, that's when we started calling people to Zoom and started the Wild Church Network really together. And then after I wrote Church of the Wild and I had started Seminary of the Wild, I was too busy to handle Wild Church Network. And so I asked if she would step in and lead the Wild Church Network. So she's been doing that since like 2021. And so she had the relationships with all of the different Wild Church leaders, which I had sort of moved beyond. And so I didn't have only those early people. So she had the relationships with these hundreds of new Wild Church leaders. So it only made sense that she would be able to reach out to these people, and she has the relationships with them. And so I thought it would be fun for us to do it together. It was hard. We would tell you, yeah, maybe it was a better idea than it was an execution. It was not easy. It's hard enough to write a book, and I have a chaotic process in that, and to invite somebody else into that chaotic process, much less your own sister. Oh, made it a challenge, but it was a beautiful challenge. Now it's something that we can feel really good about doing together.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll point out to listeners that we actually did a conversation about that book, Church of the Wild. And if they want to listen to that, just go to the website for the podcast. We'll also put it in the show notes. Hey, I want to get your take on a topic that really concerns the broader milieu of our lives today. I mean, for many of us, especially those of us concerned about the environment, this feels like a real time of crisis and uncertainty. Of course, we've been in a crisis of climate emergency for a long time now, but with all of the massive changes that the Trump administration is making to defund collaborative earth care efforts and his rolling back of clean energy programs, for example, it's really hard for many of us not to feel horrified and maybe a little bit hopeless. I wonder, your book, I think, speaks into this time of crisis without directly addressing it, but it points us again and again to the true source of hope. It points us to connection to the numinous, to God as a way to sustain us in these really troubling times. I wonder what you would say to our podcast listeners, especially those who are living with the grief of our current political situation.
Oh, yes, here it is. It's like the kinds of things that we've talked about for years. We thought it would be years to come where the real crisis would be hitting, but it's now. And we can all feel it. I keep hoping some of it is just fear, but it's sort of thrust us into that place of grief. And to avoid that grief is detrimental. But to enter into that grief takes courage, definitely takes community, takes patience. And it takes this core of, I think, what Jesus was talking about, of drawing close to one another, of living in love no matter what happens. So I feel like in a way, we who have been following the life, the message, the spirit, the indwelling of Jesus are just now going to be able to start to tap into, I think, the deeper layers of what that means. And it's not insignificant that Jesus went into relationship with the wilderness every time he prayed. The word into is a relational word in Greek. And so it's drawing us into that same prayer wisdom in a way that is urgently important. It's like we need to be listening to the voices that have been pushed aside by the dominant culture and are being literally starting to be shut down in our current culture. And it's those voices of people on the edges, BIPOC people, women, people from the Southern Hemisphere, the queer community, and the voices of nature, the voices that we actually do have capacity to hear in ways that are deeply spiritual. And when you do that, when you allow yourself to have extended time, particularly extended time where you're listening and going back to the same place and you're listening with those ears to hear the holy in and between all things. So it's like there's a process of listening, that a deepening listening, that you first go out. I do this every day. Like my first round around the block is my own voices inside my head. It's a way to kind of process those. It's not a bad thing. But if you stay with it, if you stay with the grief, if you stay with the place, if you stay sitting next to the little trickling creek or the tree outside your back door, you can deepen into the voices of the tree. You can hear the birds, you can hear the wind, and you're just with all of your senses, your voices, those little voices inside your head start to get quieter, and the voices of all that's around you, you start to hear more. And if you keep at it, if you stay there and in that place of reverent listening, you start to hear the holy within you speak.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, you're describing a discipline which maybe helps us to overcome our nature, because I don't know that it's in our nature always to listen carefully, especially to listen to difference. So I hear this almost as a means of correcting those places in us that have stopped listening. that have gotten stuck into certain perspectives and
Mm-hmm.
worldviews and understandings of what community even means, for example. You wrote in the book about wild churches that most participants identify as Christ followers, but not all of them do. I wonder if you could talk a bit about why you think that commitment to diverse spiritualities is important for any of us, whether or not we're in the wild church movement.
Right. Well, I think that our commitment to diversity, period, exactly what you said. First of all, a healthy ecosystem is diverse. You can feel it. I think in the Pacific Northwest, I feel it the most because you can walk into a forest that only has first generation new trees. They're all the same age. They're all the same species. There's not a lot of diversity. You can feel a difference between that and when you walk into a more old growth forest. A healthy ecosystem is diverse. That's true for your prairies and your forests. It's also true for the human community. Like you just said, to be only listening within your own head, within your own way of thinking, only be listening to yourself and to those who are like you is dangerous. It's not real. It's not even connected with what reality is. We can't know everything. We can't be open to infinity diversity. But to limit ourselves to only a few different voices, and this is exactly what's happening in our culture. It's why diversity is so scary to authoritarian government, because you lose something of your own soul, I think. You lose something of your own agency and your own ability to be authentic in who you are and why you are here, and your own relationship with the holy, much less your community. When you cut off the reality of diversity. Yeah. It just is. And so it's messing with not only what is meant to be in God's creation, in the intention of God, in what aliveness is, but there's also just sort of like the natural laws of how life works. And when you mess with that, it doesn't work anymore. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah, I really love that idea that ecologies are good models for us. It takes diversity to actually have a healthy ecology. And as you put it, there's a parallel in human society as well. And of course, the distance that you are trying to address is that distance of people from ecologies, right? That we don't see ourselves necessarily as part of the places where we live,
right,
as part of the ecologies in a real integral way. So I love the fact that so much of your writing in this book, so many of the stories talk about this idea of kinship, that our connection to nature is not utilitarian or transactional. I'm going to go into nature and hear God and get a message from God. It's not about that. It's more like it's reflected in the asking permission. It's viewing the rest of creation with respect, with humility, and doing what one would do to establish new relationships.
Yeah.
It's work. It takes discipline. It's not always easy. But yeah, I think it's helpful to think about it in kinship or relational terms. Now, I would love people to have, as we close, just a bit of a sense of what they can expect in the book. So I know that you've got maybe a couple of passages that you can actually read to us. I think you had told me that there's an invocation that you might want to read. And this is something that one could use in any gathering of people of like interest. So maybe you could read that to us, just an example of something that we could be borrowing from the book.
Sure.
Should we get it?
This is a wild invocation that was written by Mary Abma, and she leads wild church gathering in Brights Grove, Ontario, called Wild Edge Offerings. Here's her wild invocation. We gather together in this wild cathedral, where there are no walls or windows to separate us, from the land on which trees breathe and plants transform the sunlight, where the spirited elements dance and desire, tousle our hair and play on our skin, where everlasting cycles of birth and death and birth again are engraved in the seasons' turnings. With abundant gratitude and openness, quieted hearts and wandering souls, we pay attention, as our senses reveal their ancient knowing, and we call this sacred ground.
Let me ask you perhaps to read something that could give us a sense of the practices, of the pragmatic things we can actually do or try that are represented in your book.
Oh, there's so many good ones. This is from Lanny Lonto. She is the leader of the UP Wild Church in Marquette, Michigan, up in the Upper Peninsula. And she tells a story of, we took part in a collaborative tree planting project with the Interfaith Water Stewards and the Cedar Tree Institute. Together, we planted 500 northern white cedar trees in the Yellow Dog Community Forest. Part of our orientation to the day included an overview of forestry practices and the vital role that cedar trees play in the tradition of the Anishinaabe peoples of our region. And I can add that when in our little wild church from Bellingham, Washington, participated in a tree planting up in Bellingham, we added an aspect for the whole 300 people that were there. We suggested, before you plant the tree that you've been given to plant, just say a simple blessing. Just hold that little tree and bless that little tree before you plant it. And just that little practice creates a kinship, creates a wanting to go back and check the tree that I blessed to see how that tree is doing. So we care about all of those hundreds of trees that we planted, but we also have a particularity of relationship with that little tree.
I'll tell you something that's funny. In the Circlewood Forest, a number of us were planting trees just a couple of days ago and planting cedars and Douglas firs. And I found myself doing that, with each tree I planted. I would just speak a little blessing, almost treating it like a child. I would say, little tree, bless you to grow. I bless you to be part of this ecosystem. Just doing it to myself. But now I'm thinking, oh gosh, we could have also done that corporately. Talked about that as a joint effort.
Yeah.
A sort of common purpose that we shared together in that moment. So yeah, I love that idea very much.
Well, I love when I went to Circlewood that one time and we were building those little habitats for the little creatures. I think about that all the time. That's practicing kindness to the little ones. That's just beautiful practice. Here's another story from Laurel Dijkstra. Her wild church is called Salal and Cedar in Vancouver, BC. They share, if you brought a stone with you, take it out and hold it. Feel its heft, its weight, its shape, its texture. Think of where it came from and where you picked it up. Was it at a beach, a creek, a construction site, a backyard, a roadside? Was it from a healthy place or a threatened place or a degraded place? Think of your stone's long story, its endurance, and think about how it may speak to you of endurance for yourself and for the community of environmental care that we're part of, locally and globally. And when we return from wandering with this stone, when we return, we'll place our stones together to make a cairn. In placing our stones, we recognize that we stand in a long tradition of caring for the earth, and it spans all ages, all cultures, all faith, throughout all history. We acknowledge all those who have gone before us, and we commit an act of hope, I would say an act of radical hope, that we will not be the last to walk this way, that there will be future generations who will follow in our steps.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that that really is how all of these practices are presented. They're in the form of story, essentially. They're in the form of people telling the stories of what they've tried, things that they've created, rituals, what have you, which to me makes it a lot more readable, quite honestly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just a series of here's what you do. It's here's what I've done, learn, adapt, take it verbatim. But really, it's about creating your own, letting your place be, and your people and your community and your own creativity be in collaboration with God as we restore this severance and restore sacred relationship with our place and with one another.
We've been in conversation with Victoria Loorz, co-author with Valerie Serrels of the new book, Field Guide to Church of the Wild. For more information about the book, go to the show notes for this episode at earthkeepers.online. Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Lana Rasmussen is our podcast editor, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media coordinator. Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music, and I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Thank you, friends, for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers podcast.